Thank you. Well, I can't top that, so having said all this, we thank you very much on behalf of all of us here in the great city of Chicago. Welcome to your second home. And this is not going to be a press conference. I want to let everyone know this is going to be very free-flowing. We're going to talk hoops. We're going to talk about the city of Chicago, obviously with the All-Star game. But I would be remiss if I didn't also say thank you to the Chicago Bulls. I'm very proud to be an employee of the Chicago Bulls. Our president is here, Michael Reinsdorf, our chairman, Jerry Reinsdorf, obviously. And our organization, as the commissioner knows, gives so much back to this city, not only on the court, but also off the court. And I'm very, very proud of that, because that really is our legacy as a franchise and what we're doing in our community. So, Commissioner, having said all this, let's talk about Chicago for a moment. When did you first arrive in Chicago as a student or just visiting, and how did this organically develop over a period of time?
Sure. Well, let me also say thank you for having me here. Michael Reinsdorf, thanks for securing me for this interview. And Mary Lou, thank you for that incredible introduction. So I matriculated to University of Chicago Law School in the mid-'80s, so it was roughly 1985. I grew up in New York. I had been to Chicago before for something or other when I was in college, but really I only came then specifically to tour the University of Chicago and interview, but I came because it was an outstanding law school, and I fell in love with the South Side and the city of Chicago. I mean, it was nothing more than that, but then as you said, I then ended up going to school here. I was here for 3 full years, in essence, living in Chicago. I started at the NBA in the early 90s, so I was here an awful lot. Many, many playoff games, many finals games over that period. And so to your point, it feels a bit like my second home. I should also add, this wasn't in the intro. It didn't make the 3 pages you were reading from. But my wife was born in Chicago.
Really?
My wife's parents were both born in Chicago. So I have a family connection here as well, which I didn't have at the time I was in law school. I met her many years later.
So 1985, Jordan was drafted 84, so you caught the early Michael Jordan period. And did you go to Chicago Stadium much?
I did. You know, I was just noticing there's sort of obstructed view seats here, just sort of like I did when I was in law school. You could just go down the stadium and get tickets. I mean, it wasn't. I don't recall ever not being able to buy a seat somewhere in the arena. You know, nothing like the seats. I'm fortunate that you and I are both fortunate to have these days. But I grew up a Knicks fan in New York. I'm not allowed to be a fan of any team anymore since I started working for the league. But I certainly came whenever the Knicks played the Bulls or tried to. I don't recall, coming in, being at any playoff games in those days. But I went to a bunch of regular season games. It was a great. I mean, for those, I'm sure many of you in this room were in the old Chicago Stadium. I mean, just like the United Center. It was a different experience, but it was much more intimate. You know, and I said recently when I was interviewed leading up the All-Star weekend by the Chicago Sun-Times, and I was saying there was more of a sense of discovery back then. I mean, there obviously wasn't internet. There wasn't sort of the global coverage, or even if you followed your team generally. And I'd gone to Duke University, so I certainly knew who Michael Jordan was. I knew him from University of North Carolina. But there was none of that sense that, like, oh my God, you can't miss this guy playing. You know, there weren't, you couldn't consume highlights the way you can now. So as I said, it felt a little bit more of an underground experience. It didn't feel like everyone wanted to be there. And I actually made it to the All-Star game, which was my 3rd year in law school in 1988, which was hard to imagine 32 years ago. And I definitely remember that experience. That was a harder ticket to get, but again, I was still in law school, and just remember how, just again, like I would have never predicted at that point in my life that I would have anything to do with professional sports or work in basketball. I was obviously in law school on track to be a lawyer, but there was certainly something very special that you felt being at that All-Star game, being in Chicago Stadium. You know, the NBA, I mean, again, this was, the early days, though, of, Larry and Magic had been in the league then for a few years. I should note, Artis Gilmore, NBA royalty, is here today, so.
So the A-Trade,
It was, it just felt, it was a very special time in the league. And I think because in part, something it's harder to come by these days, that sense of discovery, that you were onto something that not everybody knew about.
Yeah. By the way, Artis Gilmore, one of the finest players in the history of the Bulls franchise, went to Jacksonville, played with another 7-footer by the name of Pembroke Burrows, and had some great games against Western Kentucky and Jim McDaniels in the NCAA tournament. Went to the ABA. They had a dispersal draft with a merger, winds up in Chicago, and had some incredible seasons here with the Bulls. So, yes. Well, that's true. But no, I saw you, Artis. Trust me. Batman and Robin, Rex Morgan. There you go. So, like, Adam, describe yourself as a fan then. Like, mid-'80s, you're at the stadium. Like, did you get into it, or were you kind of...
I was not, so, again, I'd gone to Duke University as an undergrad. I was not a paint-your-face kind of kid when I went to Duke.
Well, this was pre-Coach K. This
I
was
started.
This was with Bill Foster?
No, Coach K and I started the same year, 1980, at Duke. That's amazing, and he's obviously still the coach there. So, and famously was almost fired because, and the then athletic director, Tom Butters, stuck by him even though they didn't make the tournament. I think the first 3 years he was there,
That's
having
correct.
come off great success with Gene Banks, who ultimately played on the Bulls, and Coach Foster. But so I was an enthusiastic fan, but I wasn't a jump up and down kind of fan. I mean, I loved the game, as I said. You know, and especially growing up in New York, I was more of a pro fan than a college fan. But certainly the enthusiasm was off the charts down at Duke. It wasn't, I mean, if those people follow it, there wasn't K-ville and people weren't sleeping outside to go to games. It was interesting. There was the same sense back then that if you had your student ID, you went down to Cameron and you just walked into the game.
Really?
I mean, nobody slept outside. There wasn't much of a line. You just walked right into the game. Again, the teams weren't as good at that moment, but I lived in a dorm on campus. People know Duke University West Campus. It's sort of the stadium was a few hundred yards away from my dorm room. If the game was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I won't say you got out of bed at 2:45, but you walked down there like, you know, it was, okay, the game's on in 15 minutes, and you walked over to Cameron and you went to the game. So I loved the game. I played the game as a kid. I wasn't all that good. But I loved being around it. I mean, there's sort of an emotional connection I have to it as well. When my parents were divorced when I was very young, I lived in the suburbs of New York City. My dad lived in the city. It was an activity I did with him as a kid, going to Knicks games. So I felt a connection to the sport as a kid, and then it became increasingly drawn to it as I got older.
Okay, so now we're going to move forward. And tell me about the league today. What do you like about the league? What are some of the challenges you face day to day?
Well, I tell you, one of the things I love about the league today is the quality of the basketball. And I think that, again, just draw the contrast from sort of when we were younger, even I'm sure for you early on as a broadcaster, even trying to do your research, you know, to try to even sort of scout as you were coming up to another game. You had limited opportunities. You know, you literally had tapes, put them into machines. Yep. I think now, for example, that if you're a fan of the game of basketball and you have our league pass, well, first of all, there's a lot of games on ESPN, TNT, et cetera, local games. But then with our league pass package, just an app, you know, on any phone or tablet, or you can get it on cable or satellite television, you can see essentially any game in the league at any time. And sort of, I recognize I consume an unusual amount of it because I'm the commissioner of the league, but my sense is even teams that at a particular time aren't necessarily playing all that well, you know, you and I were just talking about the road trip you just came on, Philadelphia and Washington. I mean, there's incredible talent on every team these days. I mean, there's something to watch on every team, and I think that the style of basketball that's being played now, and I know it has its detractors too, but to me, it's aesthetically incredibly sort of pleasing in that it requires this extraordinary ball handling skills, shooting skills. I mean, these guys are athletically off the charts. So I think that's what I love about the game right now. I mean, not perfect. You know, we're constantly balancing big man issues, and you know that you know maybe the mid-range game. You know, there's things we can do to tweak the game a bit. We've moved the three-point line many times over the years. That's something we're always looking at. But I love the competitive aspect of it. I love how international our league has come. I mean, Mary Lou mentioned NBA China in my intro. I mean, when you think what's happening around the world now, roughly 25% of our players were born outside the United States. I think 8 of the 24 All-Stars were born outside the United States. So, you know, it's very much a global game. And think how competitive it is to make these positions on the teams, because, you know, unlike, to me, there's two truly global sports, soccer and basketball. Differences with soccer, there are many great leagues around the world. Obviously, there's the EPL in England, there's like Bundesliga in Germany, La Liga, et cetera. You know, in the case of basketball, even though there's many other leagues around the world, if you grow up playing basketball and you're good and aspire to be great, your goal is to play in the NBA, whether you're in Shanghai or, you know, whether you're in Johannesburg, South Africa, you know, Madrid, or wherever that place is that you're living. So that is what I love about the league right now.
And if you talk to players, whether it's Luka Doncic, who would get up at 4 a.m. in the morning like Dirk Nowitzki to watch an NBA game. Last night we're in Washington. The Wizards had 3 players in their starting lineup. Let's see, Bonga is from Germany, Mahimi's from France, Richie Hachimura, who's going to be a terrific player, born in Japan. We have Thomas Satoransky from the Czech Republic. When Larry Markkinen returns to our lineup, he's from Finland. And so this is growing and growing, and these players want to play in the NBA. There's no question about it.
And they've added a different flavor to our
Yes, they have.
as well. I mean, again, you know, you want to strike the right balance, but I think a lot of them who grew up playing soccer, there's a certain flair to their game. I think there's a certain showmanship. I mean, look at Luka Doncic, for example, our Rookie of the Year last year. I mean, there's a certain, it's great. There's a certain joy in their step. You can tell, and they embrace the entertainment side of the game as well. I mean, they know where the cameras are, and they know at the end of the day we're competing against a lot of other ways that people could spend their leisure time, and they have a little bit of a twinkle in their eye and make it fun for everyone.
Well, you've had challenges, to say the least, in your 6 years.
That was not part of the intro.
That is not part of the intro. But we are going to deal with...
Challenges.
Yes. We're going to deal with an international situation with China. And if you can just be very transparent as much as you can about the tweet Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Rockets, sent out, and it had a ripple effect in many different layers and levels.
Sure. So many people in this room probably are familiar somewhat with the story. Daryl Morey, as you said, is the general manager of the Houston Rockets. He tweeted, or in essence, I think retweeted actually, was 7 words.
Yes.
Slogan of support for the protesters in Hong Kong. He was not in China at the time he tweeted it. In fact, I happened to be on my way to Japan at the time this happened. We had played preseason games this year in India, Japan, and China. So I had just been in Mumbai, incidentally, where another, you know, country of well over 1 billion people, where they're beginning to play a lot of basketball. And for the first time in our history, we played 2 preseason games.
And that was Indiana and Sacramento?
Yep, Indiana and Sacramento. So I was... whenever it was tweeted, right before I took off or whatever, I didn't know about. I was then on a plane that had no Wi-Fi for 8 hours or so on that trip. I landed. I found out he had not only already tweeted it, but he'd already deleted it and removed it. But it was. I then heard from our folks in China. We have about 200 employees, largely between Beijing and Shanghai, who said this was a big issue in China. And I'd say it would have been a sensitive issue no matter what, but I think it was uniquely received enormous attention because he was the general manager of the Houston Rockets, which, because that was the team that Yao Ming had played for, they're almost as if they're China's team. And so there's sort of the Rockets in every other team in many ways in China. And I think Yao Ming saw it as a personal affront that somebody who was a close friend of his, Daryl Morey, had tweeted that. So what we then, my first reaction, and it was the league sort of through our China office, in essence said, to me, in a way, whether it was the right thing to do or not, an attempt to be diplomatic, we didn't apologize for the free expression exercised by one of our general managers, but said, to the extent we've upset our Chinese fans, we didn't say we apologize, but we understand that this is a sensitive issue, and let's move on. But it kept escalating to the point where I then ended up feeling I had to speak out, actually, I wouldn't say it's much in defense of Daryl Morey, but more in defense of the fact that we're an American institution and that it's something that political speech is classically protected in our society, and it certainly historically has been in the NBA. And it goes both ways. To me, I didn't see it any different than I get criticized as well because we have NBA players who speak out on domestic political issues. Obviously, some people have told them to, quote, shut up and dribble when they do. And I've supported them when they do that. And I felt, well, I've got to therefore support a general manager if he has something to say about what's happening in another place in the world. Again, it's the very nuanced issue, and that, you know, it's somewhere where I think if we're going to operate in other markets in the world, we have to be respectful and not try to impose our values on people, but we certainly have to stand by our values. So in essence, that's what I did. And in Tokyo, I was asked at a press conference whether we were planning to discipline Daryl Morey or in any way, and I said no. It's just not part of the DNA of this league. I then, the next day after we had played the Raptors and the Rockets in Tokyo, got on a plane and went to Shanghai, and those of you may remember the issue just kept getting worse, and there were images that were projected globally, in essence, through CNN and other news services of large billboards promoting the game, promoting the players, being taken down by various organizations in China. We then made a decision on the ground that we should still play these games, that we weren't looking to escalate the issue. I should point out we have a very long history in China, essentially going back 40 years when the Washington then Bullets played a game in Beijing. And as you mentioned, you know, I've been very involved in the development of so-called NBA China, you know, for almost 20 years now. And so we decided that, in fact, so much of what's great about sports is that even when there are differing views, competing systems, it's classically what brings people together, you know, as our State Department calls through people-to-people exchanges. So we played our 2 games in China and we came home. Since then, we have 2 primary broadcasters in China. One is Tencent, which is in essence a streaming service, sort of, you know, kind of as if we were on, you know, Amazon Prime or Netflix, you know, and so it's a streaming service, but also you can stream it onto your television in China. But we've been on for many years on China Central Television as well. They took our games off China Central Television as a result of this incident, and our games have not returned to
They have not.
They have not returned to CCTV. My sense is that again, it's out of my control. I mean, I know some people have suggested that, you know, we shouldn't continue to operate in China under those circumstances. I mean, again, if certainly if that was the view of our government, that would have a big impact on me, but it's also, we did negotiate a new trade deal with China. Obviously, there's enormous business we do in China, and my personal belief is that it's important that we do continue to operate there, that with so much conflict in the world, that this is an opportunity for people recognizing that there are different systems to get to know each other better. And again, you know, the consequences have been fairly dramatic. It's not just that they've taken our games off the air, we've taken a fairly significant financial hit by virtue of certain of our business partners choosing not to associate with us if the government is not going to televise our games. But again, my sense is, by the way, Mark Tatum, the deputy commissioner of the NBA, is here, and he's spent a lot of time on this issue, that through meetings, diplomatic meetings we've had over the last several months, that I think we've all come to understand each other better. As I said, there's nothing that we're going to do differently other than to keep playing our games, televising our games. And my sense is at some point our games will be restored to CCTV. Meanwhile, they're suffering through this coronavirus right now in China. I mean, we historically, when there's been catastrophes, difficult issues anywhere in the world where we operate, we've helped people. We're continuing to do that through the coronavirus right now. We've sent positive messages in terms of staying strong to the people of Wuhan, to the people of China. And I think that's a unique position that sports and a sports league can play.
Well, I appreciate that transparency. And the little time we have left before we open it up for questions, since we're on the subject of global expansion and whatnot, David Stern, let's talk about his legacy for a moment and what you learned from David Stern on a day-to-day basis, because I'm going to weave this storyline into Kobe, because we had two iconic figures pass in recent weeks in a case with Kobe and Munson in David Stern. So why don't you take it from here, Commissioner?
Sure. So I had an extraordinarily close relationship to David. When I came to work at the NBA in 1992, my first job was as his assistant. Literally, my title was special assistant to the commissioner. I then, before I became the commissioner, I had 5 other jobs at the NBA, and in every job I worked directly for David. I mean, even when I ultimately became deputy commissioner, my joke always was I was still the assistant to David Stern. They just kept changing the title. But Michael Reinsdorf obviously knew him well. Chuck, I know you got to know him well over the years. I mean, he was just a force of nature. I mean, I think at the time that he came to the league in the late 70s and then became commissioner in 1984, our finals were famously on tape delay on CBS. And when I say in sort of the late 80s or mid 80s for me with the Bulls, that sense of discovery, I mean, that sort of, the NBA was just really turning the corner of a sport that was perceived as too black, of a sport that wasn't given sort of mainstream respect. And I think David, really by force of personality, demanded that respect in the marketplace. I mean, he was a very tough person, famously, to work for, but he never asked of anyone else more than he asked of himself. He was an incredibly committed worker, late, early, weekends, etc. And he just, as I said, I think he personally just sort of drove the league to a new place. And I think there's a lot in the modern NBA, really I'd say in all modern sports, that David pretty much invented. I think even the notion, like I sort of before was talking about the entertainment side of it. I mean, I think many years ago, traditionalists would have been upset even saying those words. I can remember even time with David Stern and Red Auerbach in my early time there, where the idea that there were mascots like Red, just couldn't understand what was happening around him. But I think David, as I said, I think he should be credited many ways that while preserving what's great about the NBA, understanding this is an entertainment property, that he sort of embraced cable television, he embraced satellite television, he embraced the internet when it came, and said, we got to change with the times, and that we got to understand that if we remain in place, people are just going to move on to other things. And then the transition to Kobe, I've been thinking a lot about this lately in terms of what they had in common, because Kobe, for all the incredible things that have been said about him in the last few weeks, obviously it's his tragic passing, he was a very difficult guy. I mean, and he didn't shy away from that. I mean, it's legendary. I mean, Phil Jackson wrote a book and talked about how difficult he was to coach. Shaq had lots of things to say about him at the time they played together. And in some ways, it wasn't until he retired that people began to see another side of him. And that even to the extent and people were more accepting that he wasn't a jerk, it was more purposeful. That this was a guy in some ways like David, who was all about winning. And he was happy to say that, I want to be perceived as a good teammate, but first and foremost, I want to win. Mm-hmm. And if some guys on my team aren't going to perceive me as a good teammate, I don't really care. I want to win, I want to win, I want to win. And everything I do is going to be driven by that. And of course, he has 5 rings as a result, and 20 years on one team with the Los Angeles Lakers, and the all-time record 18 or 14, 14 was it? 18 All-Star appearances, 4 MVP All-Star appearances. I think Kareem has one more. Kareem has the record 19. And I'm looking over at Mike Bass, who's the head of communications, who knows all these things, right? 4, right?
You're the
4.
commissioner.
So I'm just saying. So I think Kobe, and I spent a lot of time with him over the last several years, really since he retired, talking about the game, how to teach the game. I'd say just lastly, one of the last meetings I had with him was actually about the WNBA. I mean, his daughter Gigi, again, like it's hard even to talk about, who tragically passed with him. I mean, he was so committed to women's basketball, at his academy, his coaching of his daughter, and so much so that he wanted to become involved in the WNBA. And we had just brought in a new commissioner, Kathy Engelbert of the WNBA. He said, tell her I'm going to reach out to her. So I said to Kathy, then I sent her a text. I said, I'm not sure, frankly, if he's ever going to reach out to you, but I gave him your cell phone number. 3 days later, they had a 3-hour meeting in her office in New York to talk about his interest in the WNBA, potentially investing in it, and all the things we could do to grow women's basketball.
Well, one of the most remarkable broadcasts I had the pleasure of calling was Kobe's 81-point game. I was the TV voice of the Raptors, and it was a Sunday night in Los Angeles. There were no A-listers, no Jack Nicholson. He wasn't there. And Kobe was playing with a lot of, role players, journeyman players. The Raptors led by 19 points early in the third quarter, and he took it upon himself. He wasn't going 1-on-5. He took on all 15 active Raptor players. And, his agent, Rob Pelinka, now the GM and my former broadcast partner at Michigan, he would say, when Kobe went to the line, he had 79 points, and the crowd wanted him to get 80. There's a difference to seeing 8 and a 7. And he said that Kobe went to the line, and there was so much pressure because everyone wanted him to get 80, and he got 2 free throws. He was taken out of the game by Phil, 81 points, and it was unbelievable to be there in that Staples Center that night.
A great moment.
Unbelievable. We're going to open it up for some questions, and so just when we go, in fact, we'll go here first. Just identify yourself if you can stand up and then ask the question.
And they have mics that they're going to hand you.
Yes, and we do have a mic, so go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ted Suter, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my
This
pleasure.
is really exciting for everyone here. So I'm friends with Troy Flanagan with the Milwaukee Bucks. He's the performance director. He's a literal rocket scientist doing amazing things with science, technology, around nutrition that he believes has had a material impact on the team's performance. And anybody who's a Milwaukee Bucks fan knows that they're having a heck of a season. So what sort of efforts around the rest of the league are you guys seeing utilizing data and science and technology to improve player performance?
Ted, it's a great question. And so it's yet another area where, looking over at Michael Reinsdorf, there's somewhat of an arms race right now around the league where it's yet a new area for teams to compete, and that's in sports science, who they hire, their practice facility, who their chef is, you name it. Like, what is it that they can do that will impact player performance? And what we're seeing is, not surprisingly, it really does make a difference. I think it's not quite the precise science that people make it out to be right now. I mean, for example, people talk a lot in our league about load management. I think the jury's out a little bit there. I think teams have different philosophies on how helpful it is for players to sit out and not play certain minutes. The real true load management isn't just minutes on the floor of the game. It's practice time, sleep, and all those other things. Where I'm pushing right now as a league, that trying to convince our teams that this is not necessarily an area where they should be competing, that they should be sharing best practices, that we have relatively short contracts in this league, and so you have no interest in a player that hypothetically could become your player one day not getting the best of kind care at a team before they come to your team. But it's something, I know our teams this is an area, we talked a little bit about European soccer before. I think they have historically been ahead of all the U.S. leagues when it comes to sports science. They start much younger in those programs with academy programs. I think they do a much better job as they're developing players, preventing them. I just use the NBA as an example, or basketball, where often you have young players it's not fair to just call it AAU, but everybody knows what I mean, but where a lot of these young players, top players, are playing 6, 7, 8 games a weekend, something, and with no incentive not to. There's always some coach, scout, et cetera, who's at that game, shoe company representative. And so they get to those young players at a younger age, and I think it's an area where we're working with our teams to say we can bring real scale to it if the league together with the 30 teams is doing certain things. But obviously, think in a star-driven league, think of what it means for fans and for, frankly, our business to keep our best players on the floor another year or two. And it's just enormously valuable. And let me just greet Mayor Lightfoot, who just came in. Thank you. Mayor, we talked a little bit at University of Chicago Law School earlier, and we were in law school in the same time at University of Chicago, and it's great to be here in your city. Thank you.
Was the commissioner talking hoops and, at that point in time? Were you exchanging ideas, scouting reports?
We were focused on a few other things like that. But Adam's right. I mean, we were in law school at the time when the Bulls were on their ascendance and still hadn't quite beat the bad boys yet. But you could get tickets a lot easier. Can you do something about that, Michael?
The reason Adam had tickets to the All-Star game that year is because the Bulls got more tickets than him. I'm only kidding.
So, okay, we'll digress. Speaking of young players, where are we at with the one and done? Where is that headed?
So just on that one and done issue, whether players should have to either play in college for a year or do something else before they come into the NBA at 19. So many of you probably know the NCAA brought in former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who also happens to be a big sports fan, and she put together, in essence, a blue ribbon commission. And her job was to sort of interview everyone out there, all the very different constituent groups, and make a recommendation to the NCAA. Ultimately, her recommendation was that to the NBA that we return to the 18-year-old minimum age instead of 19 and allow those players to come directly from high school. I've shifted my own view on it, and I was influenced by Secretary Rice. I think when I became commissioner roughly 6 years ago, I actually proposed that we go to 20 instead of 19. I think what's happened now, as I talked a little bit before, in basketball in particular, the cohort is well known of the potential top players by the time they're 13, 14 years old. It doesn't mean, I mean, if you took that top 100 players, it doesn't mean all 100 obviously are going to make it or be great players, but there's a pretty high likelihood that out of that 100 will be the top 10. And my view is if we return to 18, for that group, we could spend more time with them at a younger age in sort of European soccer-like, maybe with an academy system. It doesn't mean they have to leave home. Maybe it's in the summer. Maybe it's just throughout the year. Working with them on skill development takes some of the pressure off them from playing so many games in a weekend. Frankly, help them on the educational side as well, because there seems to be a recognition, and again, I'm a Duke graduate too, and I've talked to Coach K a lot about this, that it's not a great experience for anyone for them to come through college for 1 year. I mean, in essence, it's not really even a full academic year because they obviously have to be eligible to get through their first semester. Once they're in their second semester, it's not always the case, but with a lot of these players, and we're only really talking about 8 to 10 players, that once their team loses in the tournament or wins the tournament, NCAA tournament, they then leave school to focus entirely on the NBA draft. And it's just, again, the economics are so off the charts. I mean, these are players who have the potential to make hundreds of millions of dollars in the NBA, not even with endorsements, just in salaries if they have a healthy career. So it's very understandable. So the change, so then the question is, why haven't we made the change? I can't do it unilaterally. It has to be negotiated with our Players Association. And I think it's something we'll work through with them. It's not, and I don't know whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, but especially now that we have a G League, and so we have our so-called minor league that we can also, for players who might get drafted at 18 and might not be NBA ready, there's another league for them, sort of out of the baseball system for them to play in. So I think it's inevitable at this point now that we'll, and create, it's even something, put aside Condoleezza Rice, President Obama spoke about this 2 years ago, belief that there should be a professional track for these players rather than requiring them to be in school when the school obviously wants them for their athletic talent. They're not really there to be students.
Right.
There is a potential issue in terms of exploitation, obviously, and a lot of corrupt. I mean, it's not a secret. There's a lot of corruption, not necessarily at the colleges, maybe in some cases, but even as younger players. Again, the economics are so enormous around these players. The value is so great that I think we're better off at a professional level intersecting in their lives earlier.
Let's take another. Let's go to this gentleman right here, if we can get him, and then we'll go to the left. So if we could bring the mic, or there you go. If you could identify yourself, thank you.
Hi, Keith Cardoza. Two-part question. First part, I think I read this morning that the average NBA franchise is worth well in excess of $2 billion. And more incredibly, the growth rate has been more than 500% over the last 10 years, much faster than football, baseball, or any other sport. So first, how are you so successful in increasing the value of teams over the last decade? And secondly, on the flip side, my understanding is viewership is in decline, that especially young people, much more following players on Twitter or watching highlight reels as opposed to watching an NBA game. How does that impact the value of NBA in the future?
Yeah, well, I think sort of to answer your second question, the marketplace seems to be speaking in terms of the value of NBA franchises. If you ask why their values have gone up so much in the past decade, I think it's because it's such incredible content at the end of the day. I think that it's premier content, very difficult, almost impossible to replicate with global appeal. I think that in essence is why it's so valuable. And I think that now that the sort of two-edged sword goes to your second question is that we have a particularly young fan base. It's probably the youngest of all the major professional sports. That same young fan base has stopped watching television, the sort of standard cable satellite packages in record numbers. I mean, people talk about cord cutting or cord nevers, people who choose not to subscribe to cable, but it's much worse than that, that those young people, for the most part, don't watch traditional television. Because if they, putting aside live sports, if they have hours of time to spend, the choices that are there on Netflix or Hulu or YouTube or Amazon Prime, you name it, are so much greater than conventional television. That's where they're shifting their attention. Now, I think the issue for us, as you point out, our ratings are down a bit this year. I feel like we're sort of got caught sort of in the transition a bit because on one hand, it's great, we have this very young fan base, but they're not either subscribing to traditional television or that's not where they spend their time watching traditional television. And because of the way our rights deals are structured, largely with TNT and ESPN, those are not products that are delivered direct to consumer unless you're authenticated on your cable system. It's complicated. And so I feel pretty good about it long term, and these are issues that we have to work through though. I mean, look, ESPN is owned by Disney. Look what Disney is doing right now, for example, with Disney Plus. They made a decision that they were going to, in essence, take a step back financially in terms of foregoing the money they were getting from licensing their premier Pixar, Marvel, Disney programming to other outlets like Netflix and distribute it directly to consumers. ESPN Plus, also owned by Disney, isn't quite ready to do that. They're really providing an app that's complementary in that they're reserving the premium content still for ESPN because although there's been a big decline, it's still very profitable for them. So I think over time, again, we'll be fine because the other thing that's aiding us, on one hand, we don't have that same traditional television model, but I always say people carry a television in their pockets now. I mean, think about it, that you had to get home to watch the game. I got to get home. Now, wherever you are in beautiful HD quality, you can watch Chuck and Chicago Bulls. It's quite amazing and I think that really helps us, a property like us, where it's perishable, where people may tape delay it, but not so much anymore these days. And then the last thing, you're right, that young fan base consumes a lot of highlights and different social media aspects of the NBA, but we think that's very additive. We don't think it's a substitute for live games. We think, if anything, it just whets their appetite to want to see more NBA basketball.
Yes.
I'm a passionate fan, and one of the comments, just from a commissioner's perspective, and I hope you interpret this in the right way. Substantively speaking, the NBA, the lack of parity in the NBA is kind of striking from my perspective. So if I go and look at the NHL and the Blackhawks, for example, who's going to be in the Stanley Cup is wide open. The NFL, who's going to be in the Super Bowl, relatively wide open. But if I take a look at the NBA, other than maybe the Raptors last year, which is a little bit of a surprise, I can go back and who's going to be in the NBA Finals with a fairly high degree of probability is pretty certain. And that lack of parity creates all other category. So, you go because you love the game, but you realize that your home team that you're rooting for doesn't have a real high likelihood of success. Is that a concern of yours?
You guys weren't complaining when the Bulls were winning all those championships. It's a very fair point, and it's one that we think about a lot. I mean, maybe it surprised you. We've had 8 different teams over the last 12 years win the championship, but I think what's unique about our sport, and maybe very different than hockey, where a team can get hot going in the playoffs, particularly goaltender or whatever else, that in the NBA, it goes a little bit to the one and done question as well. You know, if everybody in this room played GM and we all had trading cards for the 450 players, and he said, all right, so which team is LeBron on? Which team is Kawhi on? When you started going through that, there are, I don't know the exact number, a dozen or so who are truly just, difference makers in this league. And so I think it's hard to create football or hockey-like parity. Having said that, I don't want to sound too defensive because it's things that we do look at a lot. And ultimately, if I step back from a fan standpoint, we want to create the best competition we can. I struggle a little bit from an entertainment value. It's interesting, even as our ratings are down a little bit. I read a story the other day where somebody was, in essence, criticizing the league because they're like, well, what happened to the Warriors? When the Warriors were so good, they were driving a lot of interest. Now there's been, well, no, he said who cares for those who couldn't hear, but no, I accept that. But it's, for example, if Kevin Durant were still there and he weren't injured and Steph weren't injured, that would be driving ratings to a certain extent. And I recognize that it's not what people want to hear in local markets. To me, I think I recognize that I don't think you could create football-type parity in the NBA. It's just 5 guys who play offense, defense, are always floor. One player can be so dominant. I mean, again, Chicago Bulls fans know that better than anyone. What we can do a better job of, what I call is parity of opportunity. I mean, what you want over time is for your best managed teams to be the most successful. I mean, I think even as much the parity we talk about in the NFL, look at the track record of the New England Patriots, for example, over many years. I mean, it seems like any team can win going into the season, but then if you step back and you look at statistically what they've done, it marvels anything that's ever happened in the NBA. So I'll just finish the answer by saying it's one of the reasons why we've been talking about other forms of competition in the league. For example, again, a concept that's European soccer fans are very familiar with, and that is the notion of mid-season tournaments or in-season tournaments or play-in tournaments. I mean, one of the things that's unique really in American sports is that you play a long season, a very long season in the case of the NBA, and it's all for one thing, this Larry O'Brien trophy. In fans of the English Premier League, for example, if you're a fan of Arsenal, whatever else, or Manchester United, there are 4 or 5 cups that those teams are competing for throughout the year. And we know one of the things that decreases the likelihood of new teams emerging are 7-game series. If you play 7-game series, you're far more likely that the best team is going to win as opposed to a win-or-go-home format where there's a greater likelihood of an upset. So maybe we can have tournaments throughout where, it's something, Michael Reinsdorf's very familiar with those concepts. So I get it. When I step back again, I think that the ultimate issue is what's in the best interest of the fan. And I hear you. And as I travel around the league, I think that's true in a lot of cities, especially if they don't feel that their team has hope. They may go and it's fun to see some great NBA basketball, but at the end of the day, they're rooting for their team and they want their team to have a chance to win.
Let's go over, if we can go over here, and then we'll go left. So I think we had a question. Yes, sir, if you can stand up, please.
Hi, I'm Bryant. Hi, you mentioned earlier about young kids watching less live TV, and that resonates to me where my kids watch mainly YouTube, occasionally movie or whatnot. And they also play less sports than I played growing up. They play eSports. I'm wondering if you sort of look out the next couple of decades, where do you see eSports going?
Again, great question. I think, and part of the issue with live sports is, one of it, we're still trying to understand it. It's not as available to them. That's part of the issue. It's also, and I have a young daughter, and she can grab an iPad and endlessly watch YouTube Kids, that I get it. It's entertaining. There seems like endless variety of kinds of things going on there. And it's hard then to create that tradition, sort of, that at least I had as a kid, where maybe you did it with a parent or whatever else. There was a weekend afternoon or something like that. You sat down, and that was really, you could control sort of their screen viewing in that way. I do worry about the participation issue. I think one of the advantages a sport like basketball has is that it's a way of getting kids to be physically fit, boys and girls. It's, I think, one of the reasons that we've been so embraced around the world, certainly in China, India, throughout Africa and other places, because it's not just in the United States, it's not just in wealthier cities, states, markets, the kids are less active. It crosses socioeconomic classes, and that increased rates of childhood diabetes, obesity, and so governments, cities are embracing this sport because it's incredibly difficult to master, but relatively easy to understand and play. It requires a small number of space. You can play 2-on-2, you can play by yourself. So we're trying to use basketball as a platform to get kids to be more active. When it comes to eSports, Mary Lou mentioned we had 4 leagues. One of those leagues is an NBA 2K is a very popular sports basketball eSports game. So we've actually created a league out of that game. Now, it's interesting. It could seem contradictory in ways that we're trying to get kids to be physically active on one hand. On the other hand, we're embracing playing eSports. But to me, I think that it's part of kids' lives. It doesn't mean they can't also be physically active. And also, one thing I love about our eSports league is that to play in the NBA or the WNBA, you have to have certain physical attributes, you know, and largely by luck of the draw, right? You know, your genetics are such, you're a certain height, certain physical ability, whatever else. And on the other hand, and maybe more so in basketball than any other sport, but there's more of a unique body type that's required to be successful. On the other hand, in eSports, really you can compete, you know, with any body type, and it's more a function of how hard you're going to work in. I mean, it does require enormous physical dexterity, but it's a much larger pool of, you know, and I'd say it's men and women. It's increasingly, we have a program to get more girls and women playing it as well. So it's a separate form of competition. And we're also, one of the reasons I'll just end by saying, there's a lot of different types of eSports. A lot of them, those games are sort of shoot 'em up, violent games and everything else. I mean, you know, without making a larger commentary on that, we're only involved in basketball, in a basketball game. And there are ways within our game where we can help promote the physical playing, moving out of that virtual world, and get these boys and girls, young men, young women who are playing also to love the real game and the physical part of it as well.
Thank you.
Well, I hate to bring this to
I
an end. We
understand
could
that.
stay here
Thank you.
almost infinitely. I want to thank the Commissioner and Chuck for a lively conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner.
I also want to thank you for being so generous to carve out time today to be with us. It was very important and meaningful to us.